Thank you all for joining us. There are a lot of theaters of conflict, diplomacy, economic competition, and warfare afoot in the world right now. Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and it's relatively cold given what's happening in those zones here in Asia, but nonetheless there are a lot of existential and monumental issues afoot, and so we are going to focus, given that we're here in Singapore, on APAC. I'm joined today by a former journalist and a current working journalist. I'm a journalist. Journalists know a little about a lot of things and nothing all at once. So with that in the mix, I wanted to start with you, John. And do you think the term national security is an oxymoron? And is it more proper to think about it as international security in the era we're in, and is there a lesson to be drawn from that, given where we are with, notably, given that we're here, the China-U.S. headbutting?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think whatever term you use, the notion that a country can be secure either physically or economically simply by retreating behind its own borders, building high walls, doing everything itself and kind of hoping for the best, I think has been totally obliterated by history. Unfortunately, in my country, there are a number of people who seem to want to revive what was a tradition, I think, that was best left in the past in the United States. And the reality is, you know, if you try to implement that sort of approach, problems around the world have a way of finding you, and your quality of life ends up lower than it might otherwise be. So I'm against that way of thinking, but it is a debate that's active in the United States right now.
How do you see that sorting itself out?
You know, I think, unfortunately, there are probably going to be some negative effects felt by that approach if it makes its way into policy, and we will learn our lessons and self-correct the way we always have. The United States does tend to be pretty good at having made mistakes, learning from them, and moving on and improving.
Tammy, right now there's a lot of economic and quietly militarized headbutting between China and the U.S. In an ideal world, I would love to see both of those issues resolved. But am I naive? How do you think directly this will play out in the near term between China and the U.S.?
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, for having me here. You mentioned this national security, or this international security. I'm a journalist. We try to look at more facts and look at different perspectives. So as a journalist, I'm not a commentator, so I'm not making kind of like comments. I'm trying to share with our audience my observation as a journalist because I've been able to talk to many newsmakers, policy makers, policy shakers. So when it comes to this, the national security versus international security, whatever we call it, I would, and John, you just mentioned the border issue, whether you need to build up a wall or something. I would like to share one or raise one little quiz to everyone here. Are we aware of how many countries that China bordered with? It's 14. 14 countries directly bordered with China. From the north, up north, we see Russia, North Korea, Mongolia, and then we see in the Central Asia part, we have Kazakhstan and some of these are Central Asia countries. And in the southern part or southeast part, we see India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and I try to refresh my memory to just mention a few. Nepal, Laos, Vietnam, 14 total. So when it comes to national security, whatever it is, I think for China, if you talk about China and the U.S., first of all, China is a part of Asia. It is in Asia. And with a 14 country surrounding it, I think for all the reasons that China wants to have a peaceful coexistence with all these countries, not to mention the whole Asia, because China is the biggest country in Asia. Any conflict in whatever format will affect China's own stability and China's own interest. And then when it comes to the U.S., we are now talking about these are the two big elephants in the room when it comes to Asia. For the U.S., of course, the U.S. has a lot of interest in Asia as well. And the U.S. is the world's biggest power. That's undeniable. But for China, this is where it is. So I put it in this way, through my team's coverage about China and the world, China and Asia, China and EU, China and the U.S. I think there's every reason when China wants to maintain the kind of like a more peaceful environment in Asia, and by working at least to reduce conflicts or to handle any differences between China and the U.S. I do see this national security tightly tied to, actually another term better describe it should be national interest. Every country has its own national interest. So U.S. has U.S., China has China's, all the other Asian countries has its own as well. And Asia is so big. When we talk about Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Korea and Japan and all this. So different areas, actually they have a different interest. It's all a matter of let's trust in the wisdom of leaders from different countries to try to properly handle differences and try to find common ground. This is how I see it.
So Tammy, in the context of China wanting to have peaceful relationships with its neighbors and finding common ground, over the last 10 days or so, there's been a very sharply worded exchange between Japan and China.
Yeah.
Because China voiced its concerns about the fate and future of Taiwan. And Chinese officials responded with very strong language aimed at Japan's new prime minister that didn't come across to me as neighborly or an olive branch in the hopes of future peace. Am I just reading that too much like an American?
I think China-Japan relations, eventually there's also an American factor, U.S. factor there. It comes to the crux of the issue. Actually, it's about Taiwan, as Tim, you rightly pointed out. Anything between China, we all know why this latest spat happened. It's because of Prime Minister, the Japanese new Prime Minister, some comments about Taiwan. And Taiwan, we all understand, is the red line, uncompromised red line for China. And so the whole thing actually is about Taiwan. But for me, according to my interactions and my observations by my interactions with some of these experts, including some officials in Beijing and in other related areas, personally, I don't think there will be an imminent kind of a threat for any military clashes over the Taiwan Strait. It's only that China or Beijing must make it very, very clearly Taiwan is China's internal matters, and any foreign inappropriate interference into the Taiwan issue is something that Beijing cannot accept. And I think for the U.S., maybe John, you have better ideas. I think the U.S. government, after China and Beijing, they signed these 3 joint communiques, which enable the normalization of China-U.S. relations decades ago. That 3 documents have been the major reference for Beijing when it looks at the Taiwan issue. And U.S. presidents, many presidents, have been quite cautiously not to cross the red line And one thing very interesting, I think maybe, John, you have a better interpretation, is that during the latest summit between President Trump and President Xi in Busan in Korea, President Trump did not even raise the issue of Taiwan. I still remember that day in my newsroom, we were talking about how to cover this, the summit is such a big news. And then eventually, oh my God, they did not touch on Taiwan. So in journalism, sometimes something happened. Of course, it is a big news. Something that was omitted can be a bigger news. So why President Trump did not mention Taiwan? Probably he wants to focus more on tariff and the
We'll jump in on that, John. Is that why Trump didn't mention Taiwan? Is because he wanted to focus on tariffs?
So it won't surprise you. I'm not closely consulted on the preparations that the White House and President Trump made for this meeting. There was, as everybody knows, a lot of speculation in the run-up to that meeting about a whole wide range of issues that might be covered, possibly the lifting of significant U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductors. That didn't happen. Possibly some shift in U.S. doctrine or policy when it comes to Taiwan. That didn't happen either. By the way, I think those are good things from the perspective of the United States, that there weren't changes made in those areas. But this problem is not resolved. I think it's safe to say. I do think, they bought some time now where the temperature is lower than it was, but there could be as many as 4 meetings between these two leaders, or at least 4 instances in which they'll be in the same place. Probably a visit to Beijing, probably a visit to Washington, APAC, G20. So, each one of those is going to have these same set of issues come back to the fore, some negotiations in advance between the two teams about what the outcomes will be. These meetings are always carefully prepared. So there are going to be more opportunities, I think, for this to be discussed. And, it's just the first year of the second Trump term. There's a lot more to come.
Apart from Taiwan, which is apart from a very big thing, but it's useful to consider this recent kerfluffle with Japan over this, because a number of Asian nations right now, whether it's South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, obviously, Australia, are all having to grapple with what is something of a vacuum in terms of how to understand where the United States, which I think has become an unpredictable and unreliable ally in terms of national security or international security issues. And they're trying to navigate how to fill that gap. And I think Japan decided to enter it with a very strong voice. We've heard strong statements from Singapore this week here at the forum. Is that the route? Is that the best route for Asian nations to go in this environment?
Yeah, look, it's a strange predicament in some ways to be a U.S. official, or in my case, a former U.S. official coming to parts of the world like this and talking about what's happening. Because, not that long ago, our disposition, which was probably a bit condescending, would be to come and tell you about all the problems that are happening in your region and what we think you should be doing about it. Now, I often find when I speak at events like this, I'm requested to explain what's happening back home and maybe getting some advice from people here about what we should do about it, which is a different sort of position for the U.S. So I have a lot of humility with what I'm about to say, but so I'm not really in a position to tell countries here how they should be handling us. But I will say a lot has changed in a relatively rapid amount of time. Whatever you think of the Biden administration's approach to Asia, and I'm not naive enough to believe there are not critiques, including maybe some similar critiques to what you hear about the Trump administration. The one thing that we would say to countries in this region and elsewhere is that we're not asking you to choose between the United States and China, but we do feel very confident about the value proposition we offer to our partners. We may not be able to waltz in and write enormous checks and revamp your country's entire infrastructure, but we are a reliable, predictable partner. We play by the rules. We stand up for the rules in the international system, rules that have helped, I think, this region maybe more than almost any other become
But you think that's how the U.S. is perceived right now?
And so that's what I was getting to. And I think that is something that has changed dramatically. I think today the country that probably more than the United States is trying to make that argument is actually China. And that is a big strategic shift. It's a big strategic, I think, disadvantage for the United States to have ceded ground on issues of rules because we are the ones now taking aggressive actions, including with our partners and allies when it comes to trade. We are the ones also taking some significant actions when it comes to the use of force in our own region. I'm talking about now in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific that call into question our commitment to rules that have been in place for decades. And so, you know, I do worry about that, and I do think it's possible that even future U.S. administrations, depending on how this plays out, may draw lessons that some of this actually works. And I think that's maybe the scariest thing of all.
And works in the context of disrupting the status quo?
Works in the context of actually extracting from partners and non-partners significant concessions that, at least in the near term, may be seen as benefiting the United States. If the rest of the world responded to the Trump trade approach by saying, we're just going to let you commit self-inflicted wounds and you're going to do whatever you want and we're going to continue to behave and operate as we were and not going to step forward with a bunch of concessions, that would have one lesson that it might impart on American policymakers. But when countries come forward and say, actually, we're willing to do this and that just to get off of this incredibly high tariff situation, I think, you know, that will lead to different lessons, including by future administrations in the United States.
Just a reminder that we can take questions from the audience if you have them. I'll see them on my iPad and dutifully try to get to some of them. Tammy, how does China view the Trump administration? And do you think they have clarity on how best to secure China's own interests in the Trump era? Or do you think they're off balance themselves?
Well, I'm very glad that John just mentioned that when you talk about, you know, we are not asking the Asian countries to pick sides. I presumably you mean the administration, right? Whoever is the president. I think this is when for China, as I just mentioned, China is part of Asia. It is here, and China is with all these neighbors, all these Asian countries, and China now is the world's second largest economy, unavoidably, and China is growing, and China has very close trade ties, and everything with all these neighbors. They must work together. This is the reality. And then the U.S. is the superpower. So Asian countries, for all the reasons, they must handle this too. But I think for China, whether China is well prepared in dealing with President Trump, especially President Trump's 2.0, I think now China is much better prepared comparing with Trump 1.0. The thing is, I do believe Beijing leadership, whoever who is sitting in the White House, Beijing still wants to maintain relatively peaceful relations with the U.S. I think President Trump, a couple of years ago, when he met President Biden, he mentioned China-U.S. relationship cannot be, it's impossible for China-U.S. relationship to go back to what it used to be years ago, decades ago, which means it's relatively quite peaceful. But with joint efforts, the two major powers, they should be able to forge better future relationship. I think that it's only good for China, for bilateral, and for Asia, and for the whole world. If these two superpowers, they can forge a relatively peaceful relationship. And I also find this this kind of theory, whether the number one will contain the number two, or whether the number two will be the number one. From all my conversations with all the Chinese academics or officials, I get this impression: China does not want to be the world's number one. They're very happy to play as the second fiddle, and to be the number one is very costly, and China is far from ready for that.
But it sure seems to me like both Trump and Xi both want to be number one, I have to say.
In terms of,
I don't see either one of them being content being number two.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing trade conflicts and questions about military confrontations.
May I chip in here? I think there are quite some similarities between President Trump and President Xi. President Trump's slogan is to make America great again. And for President Xi, when he stepped up to be the leader of China in 2012, his slogan has been always to realize the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which means that China should grow and should be a strong nation. But it doesn't necessarily mean that China wants to be the number one and overtake the U.S. Actually, honestly speaking, there is a big gap between China and the U.S. in many fronts. That's also the reality, even though China may...
But to its credit, China's closed a lot of those gaps, and it's intending to continue to do so. How do you read that, John?
Well, look, I think this is a fundamentally competitive relationship between these two countries. I think there are times when leaders, actually, to be honest, more so Chinese leaders than American leaders in recent times, have wanted to downplay the notion of competition between the two countries. But I think the reality is this is a competitive relationship. But it has to be a relationship in which the competition takes place within certain constraints and certain safeguards, because it would be a disaster for the world and for the two countries themselves if this competition were to tip over into conflict. And so that means diplomatic relations are important. That means when it comes to trying to address big global problems, like climate, like global health, like the collaboration the two leaders talked about when it comes to drugs and fentanyl recently, that they are able to work together. But, you know, the United States is pretty clear that we will take seriously the competition with China when it comes to technology, that we consider this region a strategic priority for the United States. We will have a significant military presence, significant economic relations with the countries of this region. And I think we feel good over the long term, whatever administration is in office, about the prospects of the United States in a situation in which the rules are fair and both sides are adhering to them, will be able to succeed in that competition. I think China probably feels the same way.
We have 8 seconds left, and the clock is ticking. Tammy, really briefly take out your crystal ball and tell me, in an ideal world, where will the Asia-Pacific relationship with the United States be a decade from now?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. Just imagine that I have. I mean, I absolutely agree with what John just said. I think in the near future, China and U.S. Unavoidably there will be competitions in many fronts. But if we can, the two leaders on the two countries can manage it in a way, and just take this AI, for example. We are all talking about AIs, and I do see that China and U.S. actually they can work together about AI governance, at least for civilian usage. And that will be one way for the two countries to make great contributions to the to the world. So in 20 years, I cannot predict the future, but that's my hope. I do hope these two countries, they can find more common grounds than escalating differences.
John, really quickly.
Sure. So the United States is about to celebrate its 250th anniversary as a country. We often get told when we come to this part of the world about the ancient nature of civilizations here and the lessons that should be drawn. The lesson I draw from American history is that we may be going through a difficult time right now in some ways, but we've gone through difficult times in the past. We've had a civil war. We've had significant political violence in the United States in the not so distant past. And the United States has demonstrated, I believe, beyond what any other country on earth has shown, an ability to learn lessons, to course correct, and to keep moving forward. And people that have bet against that historically have been wrong.
John Feiner, Tammy Tan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.